As competitive trading card games progress through their stay in the spotlight, it's only natural with set progression to experience a concept that will make any competitive player groan: power creep. It's simultaneously frustrating to see strategies and cards that you loved during the game's infancy lose relevance as new and more powerful cards are released that simply function on a whole different competitive level. But at the same time, power creep comes as an inevitability. If you want to sell packs and keep interest in the game's competitive scene, you need to keep players' interest by giving them a prize to chase and a fresh environment to keep playing in. As power creep continues to escalate, it's pretty common to find cards that end up having very little impact on the competitive scene, despite being extremely powerful by early standards for the game. Today, we'll be taking another dive into the Digimon TCG to examine 5 cards which had potential to be crazy powerful competitive powerhouses, but sadly released a bit too late into the game's history to make any substantial impact. We'll be kicking off today's discussion with Canon Dron from BT15. Canon Dron is 12 to play, 4 to digivolve, and has 12,000 DP. At the end of your turn, once per turn, if your opponent has 4 or more memory, delete one of their Digimon with the lowest DP. At the end of your opponent's turn, once per turn, if you have 4 memory or less, delete one of their Digimon with the highest play cost. Canon Dron likely is bringing back war flashbacks for anyone who played in a BT15 pre-release event. The effects this card brings to the table are painfully restrictive for the opponent and can bind them to suboptimal play patterns lest they lose their hard-earned board state just for trying to memory choke you. Canon Dron is only an uncommon, and for that rarity does a shocking amount, to be honest, but sadly released belonging to a pair of colors with some pretty intense competition for mega level slots. Especially by BT15 standards, both black and red have a slew of decks, many of which even overlap with both colors, with extremely powerful top ends that you would need extreme incentive to replace. And sadly, Canon Dron just doesn't cut it. With that being said, had Canon Dron released during the first few sets of the game, even if it had only belonged to one of its 2 colors, there's a good chance he would have been an absolute juggernaut. For starters, we've talked a lot in past videos about the early archetype known as Megazoo, a strategy that hard-played, high-impact megas in an attempt to control the board. Canon Dron certainly would have fit this deck insanely well, especially given that it rewards you for passing your opponent high volumes of memory. But even outside of this strategy, during a time period when decks had to be fairly memory efficient, forcing your opponent to pass you tons of memory in order to avoid serious consequences basically would have meant keeping them locked in their breeding area for the early turns of the game. On top of that, while Canon Dron has a fairly expensive Digivolution cost, it's interesting to note that because of how his own end of turn effect works, evolving into him while at 0 memory would cause his effect to trigger naturally, meaning a careful pilot would set up easy and repeatable removal the opponent didn't have any control over. I think it would be interesting to see an early meta deck built with Canon Dron in mind, but there's a good chance he would have been a bit too much for those early days of the game. Next up, let's discuss Clavis Animon from BT11. Clavis Animon is 12 to play, 4 to digivolve, and has 12,000 DP. When digivolving, if you have 5 or less security, recover 1. During your opponent's turn, if a card is removed from your security stack, one of their Digimon gets minus 4,000 DP. This is not a once per turn effect. Clavis Animon on first read looks like an incredibly brutal control card, and it has the potential to be exactly that. Having repeatable DP reduction anytime your opponent tries to aggress you, while also helping to enable his own effect by granting you an extra security, makes for a pretty well-rounded and self-contained boss monster. Yellow had a lot of on and off presence during the earliest formats of the game, with early sets bringing control strategies like Shine Greymon, as well as infamous aggro decks including War Greymon and Lord Nightmon. Clavis feels like kind of a card that would have found a home on the control side of things. The fact that he not only knocks off small bodies with each security check, but also can shrink larger bodies, especially those looking to make multiple security checks, would have been pretty annoying to try to break through. While Yellow still very much holds a competitive presence in many forms, Clavis is unfortunately outclassed by other defensive options. Most specifically, he faces competition from the mighty bulwark, Shadow Seraphimon. Shadow Seraphimon trains the DP reduction effect for a debatably more powerful, repeatable Digivolve effect, and he swaps the on Digivolve recovery for on deletion, while also getting to apply a massive DP drop to something in play afterwards. This pseudo protection, which I guess could more appropriately be called built-in consequence, means that removing him from the field is much scarier. While Clavis might look intimidating on the field during his brief stay, without any effects to de-incentivize his destruction, he's basically just a big target. Sadly, he lacks the offensive pressure that other modern angels, such as regular Seraphimon, have as well, leaving him falling a bit short and out of contention for mega slots, despite what are actually some pretty solid effects. Next up, let's talk about Dino Rexmon from BT9. Dino Rex is 13 to play, 5 to Digivolve, and has 13,000 DP. When Digivolving, for each tamer your opponent has in play, suspend an opposing Digimon and gain a memory. During all turns, once per turn, when an opposing Digimon with 6,000 DP or less becomes suspended, you may delete that Digimon. This is a great example of a card that has always felt so close to being playable. Dino Rex has a ton of things going for it. A competitive stat line of 13,000, which can swing over many common Mega level Digimon even while unbuffed, and despite a costly 5 Digivolution cost, has potential to be much cheaper by refunding memory for each tamer your opponent has in play. But that's also where the problems start to show. Dino Rex simply relies too much on what your opponent is doing. Not every deck is going to be playing tamers at all, much less enough to refund a significant portion of the Digivolution cost. And while the removal effect is actually pretty sound, being both an offensive tool that can trigger off your own suspend effects, including Dino Rex's, but a defensive tool that discourages attacking with smaller bodies. Dino Rex is an ex-antibody Digimon that has ties to other various dinosaur-themed Digimon, such as Triceramon, Monochromon, and Tyrannomon. But sadly, there hasn't really been a deck strategy that combines all of these in a way that really wants Dino Rex's unusual abilities. But if you were to put him into the earlier days of the game, ooh yeah, that could be a different story. For starters, 13,000 DP is obviously an extreme oddity for a level 6 Digimon at the time, but being able to refund memory would also have potentially given him a leg up on other competitive megas during the day, especially considering that in that time, it was fairly common to see generic memory setters being run, if not other tamers, to support different archetypes. Combine that with an effect that would not only topple virtually every level 3 and 4 Digimon, but also the commonly played vanilla level 5s, and Dino Rex could have easily become an absolute menace. I could actually see Dino Rexmon eventually finding a home in the competitive scene one day, especially if sideboards were eventually implemented into the competitive scene in some capacity, but even then, competition for anti-aggro cards is generally pretty tight, so it's pretty unlikely he'll be showing up in an Eggman video anytime soon. Next up, let's take a look at Black Mega Gargomon from EX4. Black Mega Gargo is 13 to play, 5 to Digivolve, and has 13,000 DP. At the end of your turn, up to 2 of your black or green Digimon gain Reboot and Blocker, the Black Digimon Special. During all turns, when another Digimon becomes suspended, you can also unsuspend this Digimon. Black Mega Gargomon is a living fortress. It has 2 high-impact abilities that work incredibly well together, allowing it to be both an offensive powerhouse, pushing out multiple attacks per turn, while never fully dropping your shields, allowing you to generate both halves of the tried-and-true black effect combo, Reboot and Blocker, to ensure you always have defenses to fall back on even if you weren't able to end the game. Not only that, but since Black Mega Gargo specifies that he unsuspends when any Digimon is suspended, it also means that if your opponent attacks you and gets blocked, he'll unsuspend on any following attacks and be able to block a second time. Black Mega Gargo even has the benefit of belonging to the evolution line of one of the 3 protagonists of one of the anime series, and as a result has a long string of support that can help craft him into the war machine that his alternate art would have you believe that he is. Unfortunately, the general strategy that his evolution line wants to push for doesn't really need him. On one hand, you have a pile of alliance support, which actually isn't too bad, being able to suspend one of your other Digimon for an extra check, which immediately triggers his unsuspend ability. But there are just better options if alliance is the route that you want to go on. On the other hand, you have the more low-to-the-ground Armor Rapidmon route, which doesn't run many level 5s to bridge into Black Mega Gargomon, since his Ace counterpart can evolve directly onto Rapidmon anyway, and frankly, just does a lot more to impact the board state. Just like the other entries on our list, if Black Mega Gargomon had released just a bit sooner, I could have seen this card becoming a real menace for either half of his color identity. Carrying the same Titanic stat line as Dino Rex, and carrying a delightfully synergistic ability suit that, as mentioned, could have him become both an offensive and defensive powerhouse. Without hard removal, not much in the first few sets of the Digimon TCG would have been a match for this metal menace, and it's probably a good thing that he wasn't around to terrorize those much simpler formats. Finally, before we wrap things up, let's talk about potentially the most tragically late release the game has ever seen, Victory Greymon from EX4. Victory Greymon is 12 to play, 4 to Digivolve, and has 12,000 DP. When Digivolving, delete an opposing Digimon with 6,000 DP or less, but you can add 2,000 to this threshold for each Digimon your opponent has in play, making the minimum technically 8,000. During all turns, once per turn, when an opposing Digimon is deleted, if you have a Tamer in play, delete one of your opponent's Digimon with the highest DP. Okay, so there is a lot to unpack here. I've actually heard many newer players joining the Digimon community question why this card doesn't see competitive play, and it's honestly kind of hard to blame them. In a way, this card is almost like a more streamlined version of Canon Dron, with repeatable deletion effects that can carve your opponent's board state into ribbons. He even has the divine honor of holding the single most desired name in the entire Digimon franchise, Greymon. But that name, for all its strengths, is actually Victory Greymon's biggest downfall. Belonging to the Greymon archetype means you now have to compete with every other Greymon in existence for a spot in people's deck lists. And sadly, there is very, very little to help distinguish Victory Greymon over other alternatives. Want on Digivolve removal? Here's Black War Greymon, who not only can split what he hits, but can also remove Tamers. Want to control the opponent's board state? Here's BT12 War Greymon, which can attack twice, potentially with piercing and extra checks, hit unsuspended Digimon, and brings potential reboot and blocker on top of it. To be completely honest, Victory Greymon feels much more at home in Greymon's sister archetype, Gallantmon. Gallantmon as an archetype since the very beginning has been themed heavily around DP-based deletion effects, and even features several support cards that help to natively boost the thresholds that you can select. But unfortunately, this identity crisis is exactly that, an identity crisis. Without the Gallantmon or Growlmon name, Victory Greymon has virtually no synergy to speak of with the archetype outside of the effects themselves. And since the other half of Gallantmon's gimmick is milling cards, without a related archetypal name, it's likely that anybody running Victory Greymon in these decks is just going to mill it and have to stare at it in the trash for the remainder of the game, lacking a proper way to pull it back out. But man, can you imagine if Victory Greymon had existed during the BT 1 through 3 era? This card would have been an absolute nightmare. Imagine an opponent establishing this card and you think, whatever, no big deal, I still have bodies on board. You attack into their security, but whoops, you died on the check. Victory Greymon now triggers again and you have just lost your beefiest Digimon as well. During the days when Digimon decks were largely just good stuff soup, Victory Greymon would have absolutely dominated the meta, almost unquestionably. This effect is a big step above what early decks would have been capable of, but sadly by the time of his release, the vast pool of Greymon support that didn't want his gimmick, and the large pool of Gallant support that didn't want his name, and the increasing intensity of archetype-specific value cards relegated this card to a very cool, often overlooked, empty promise of power. And that's going to do it for today's video. The Digimon TCG has created some really cool cards in recent sets. Cards that I know I and many others wish could see play, but you know the reality is that they just barely don't have the stuff needed to make the cut. Are there some cards that you love and wish had been released just a bit sooner? Be sure to leave those down in the comments below. Don't forget while you're down there to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss my next upload. With that, I am an avid herpetologist. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.